It's week 9 of the fantasy football season, and in week 8, we saw 16 quarterbacks score at least 18 fantasy points. That is some great production for the quarterback position. So now we need to dive into the top 20 quarterbacks for week 9 to see if we can find those guys that are going to put up some points. Now, just like we always do to kick off ranking shows, I gotta talk about a few of my bigger hits and misses from just last week in week 8 here at the quarterback position. And we take a look at our hits. We got Kirk Cousins, Kyler Murray, Patrick Mahomes. I had Kirk Cousins ranked super high last week, higher than probably higher than most people out there that even put together rankings, just due to the matchup going up against Tampa Bay alone. That one paid off. Kyler Murray, keeping him up inside the top 12. A lot of people want to jump ship on Kyler Murray. I know he stresses you out in your fantasy football matchups, but we can't jump ship just yet. And then Patrick Mahomes, we've been dropping him further and further down the rankings the past couple weeks, and it's actually been paying off. Now, when we go over to the misses, we got the likes of Caleb Williams, Bo Nix, and Trevor Lawrence, 3 guys that I was way off on in week 8. For Caleb Williams, I had him ranked way too high. I expected more in the matchup going up against Washington. Bo Nix, Bo is balling out of control right now. I did not have him ranked high enough, and the same goes for Trevor Lawrence. He really hasn't been someone we can count on consistently in fantasy football, and there's no way I had him ranked high enough for what he did in week 8. But now let's move past week 8, let's move on to week 9 and take a look at our top 20 quarterbacks. And we're going to kick it off right here in Tier 1, where we have Jalen Hurts, Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, Jaden Daniels, Patrick Mahomes, and Matthew Stafford. A couple new additions to Tier 1 here, but let's start off with Jalen Hurts. He's got a matchup this week going up against Jacksonville, and he has been on fire since the team's week 5 bye. He has had at least 21 fantasy points in 3 straight ball games. He's had 5 rushing touchdowns over the last 2 weeks, and 9 total touchdowns in the last 3 games. Now he gets a matchup going up against Jacksonville, who allows the second most fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks at 22.6. I got Jalen Hurts at number 1 this week. Then we go down to Josh Allen, going up against Miami. Another guy who's been hot. Over his last 3 games, he's had at least 20 fantasy points in each of them, and most of it is actually being done with his arm. He's averaging his lowest rushing yards per game of his entire career right now, and he's not even utilizing Amari Cooper in the passing game as of yet. Now, typically, in matchups going up against Miami, he owns them. 2+ touchdowns in all but 1 career game against them. However, Miami does allow the fewest fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks in the NFL, but for whatever reason, Josh Allen has the number of the Miami Dolphins, so he's still here at number 2. Then we go down to number 3, it's Lamar Jackson going up against Denver. And Lamar is getting a new weapon in Deontay Johnson. Now, whether he gets him this week, that is still questionable. But Lamar is still the overall quarterback 1 in fantasy football, averaging 25 fantasy points per game, has had at least 40 rushing yards in every game this season. Now, a matchup going up against Denver, this defense is no slouch. They allow the 4th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, but it's Lamar Jackson, and he's on an MVP pace. Now, I know a lot of people are getting worried that he did not practice on Wednesday. Sounds like it was just a rest day, and Lamar should be good to go this week. Then we go down to Jaden Daniels of the Washington Commanders going up against the Giants. He had sore ribs in week 8, but it didn't really slow him down. Or did it? If it wasn't for that crazy Hail Mary touchdown at the end of the game, Daniels would have only scored 15 fantasy points and would have finished as the quarterback 21 overall. But we know this kid is elite. Give the Chicago defense a little bit of credit. When they're paying attention to the field, they actually play pretty good football. Now a matchup going up against the Giants, they allow the 11th most fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, and we know that Jaden Daniels is much better now than he was in their previous matchup back in week 2. Now after Jaden Daniels, it gets a little bit weird because I just talked about how we've been dropping Mahomes in the rankings, and now all of a sudden he's back up inside Tier 1. But why? It's because he's facing Tampa Bay. I mean, the matchup is that good. Now, I know it's crazy when we take a look at Patrick Mahomes overall for the season. He's the current quarterback 21 on the year, and he's really turned into a guy that's not some weekly must start. Only 3 games this year with multiple touchdowns, only 3 passing touchdowns over the last month of the season. Now, we should see a little bit more DeAndre Hopkins this week, and then the matchup going up against Tampa Bay, who allows the most fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. Maybe we get a ceiling game from Mahomes here in week 9. But after Mahomes, we also have Matthew Stafford up inside Tier 1 going up against Seattle, and we've really Seen this happen before, right? Los Angeles gets healthy second half of the season, they go on a huge late season run, and Matthew Stafford just goes off. Well, last week he got Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp back. He had multiple touchdowns for the first time in a game here in 2024, and when everyone is healthy in Los Angeles, Matthew Stafford is easily a top 10 overall quarterback. Now a matchup going up against Seattle, who allows almost 17 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. It may be a little bit bold, but I got Matthew Stafford at 6 overall, up inside tier 1. Now, before we dive into tier 2, I gotta shout out today's sponsor, Turtle Beach. Now, I don't know if you realize it or not, but it's already Halloween. And you know what that means? It's gonna be Thanksgiving before you know it, and then the next thing you realize, it's Christmas morning. Don't procrastinate. Don't wait to get some Christmas shopping done now. Every one of us out there has someone in our life that probably needs a new headset, a new keyboard, even a new mouse. But everything is crazy expensive right now, so let me give you a discount. Now, if you use some discount code to go buy somebody a present, don't worry, your secret is safe with me. So do me a favor and head over to turtlebeach.com. High quality products that aren't gonna break the bank regardless. But then, if you use our promo code headliners at checkout, you're gonna get 10% off your entire order. That's right, you heard me correctly, that's 10% off your order at turtlebeach.com with promo code headliners. Now, if you need them, there's links down below in the description, but let's dive back into the rankings and tier 2. In tier 2 is where we got Sam Darnold, Joe Burrow, Kirk Cousins, Jared Goff, Baker Mayfield, Bo Nix, Joe Flacco, and Kyler Murray. Now for Sam Darnold, he's got a matchup going up against Indianapolis, and he's still averaging right around 17 fantasy points per game. Now he gets an offense that's fully healthy due to the return of TJ Hawkinson at the tight end position. Now Darnold, he's been super consistent, and now he gets a matchup against a team in Indianapolis that allows the 12th most fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. Then we got Joe Burrow going up against the Las Vegas Raiders. Now, Burrow's the current quarterback 6 overall, but he does have back-to-back games under 15 fantasy points. He really needs to get T. Higgins back to have a ceiling game. His 3 worst games of the season are the 3 games that T. Higgins has missed, and yes, he's still currently questionable to play in a matchup going up against Las Vegas. They allow over 17 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. I got Joe Burrow at number 8. Number 9, it's Kirk Cousins going up against Dallas, and this dude absolutely owns Tampa Bay, but outside of that has been a little bit underwhelming. He has 14 passing touchdowns on the season. However, 8 of them came in the 2 games against Tampa Bay. But this one right here is a really good matchup going up against Dallas. They allow the 6th most fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, so Kirk Cousins at number 9. Then we got Jared Goff going up against Green Bay. He's had at least 15 fantasy points in 5 straight ball games, averaging 17 fantasy points per game, and now we have another game without Jamison Williams. But I don't even know if that matters to Jared Goff. He has had multiple touchdown passes now in 5 straight ball games, but what's crazy is last week against Tennessee, he only threw the ball 15 times. He ended up with 85 passing yards and 3 touchdowns. Detroit put up a 50 spot and barely had to throw the football. Now they're going up against Green Bay, who allows only 15 fantasy points per game, so I got Jared Goff at number 10. Then at 11, we got Baker Mayfield going up against Kansas City, and the Bake Show is still going off even without Chris Godwin and Mike Evans. Last week against Atlanta, 330 yards and 3 touchdowns. He's the current quarterback 2 overall in fantasy football, averaging 24 fantasy points per game, has scored at least 23 fantasy points in 5 straight games, and we know that they're not going to be able to run the ball on the ground against Kansas City. They're going to have to throw. Now, right now, Baker Mayfield's top offensive pass catcher is tight end Cade Otton. And what's great about that, Kansas City struggles against tight ends more than any other position. Those two are going to have to find the end zone again, and Baker's at number 11. Then we go down to Bo Nix going up against Baltimore. All the way up to quarterback 9 on the season now is Bo Nix. 21 plus fantasy points in 3 of his last 4 games played. Has had at least 60 yards rushing or a rushing touchdown now in 4 straight ball games. Multiple touchdown passes in 3 of his last 4, and has led Denver to 5 wins over their last 6 games. And now he gets to go on the road and face Baltimore, who allows the 3rd most fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. It's a lot harder to run on Baltimore than it is to throw on them, so Bo Nix is at number 12. Which takes us down to number 13. It's Joe Flacco of the Indianapolis Colts, the foreseeable starter in Indianapolis in a matchup this week going up against Minnesota. Now, he's played in 3 games this year and had multiple touchdown passes in all of them. He helps every single offensive weapon in this offense. The passing game is going to be so much more successful, and that's going to only help open up the run game for Jonathan Taylor. Now, a matchup going up against Minnesota, they allow over 18 fantasy points per game, and if Minnesota can get a lead early and the Indianapolis Colts are playing catch-up like they normally are, Joe Flacco could put up some fantasy points in week 9. Which then only leaves us our last quarterback here in tier 2. It's Kyler Murray going up against the Chicago Bears, and he's up to the quarterback 8 overall on the season. He scored at least 21 fantasy points in 3 of his last 4 ball games and just had his first 300-yard passing game of the season. It's crazy how that works. When you actually throw the ball to Marvin Harrison Jr., good things happen. But we got to be somewhat careful here in this matchup. He's going up against Chicago, and we really saw Chicago limit Jaden Daniels and the Washington Commanders last week. Like I mentioned earlier, if it wasn't for that late game Hail Mary touchdown, Jaden Daniels wouldn't have finished inside the top 20. The Chicago Bears actually allow the second fewest fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, so Kyler Murray's still in tier 2, but the bottom of tier 2 at number 14. Which will take us down to tier 3, where we got Caleb Williams, Tua Tagovailoa, Geno Smith, Jameis Winston, CJ Stroud, and Aaron Rodgers. Now for Caleb Williams, he's going up against Arizona, and he's coming off one of his worst games of the season. Can't really expect a huge game every single week, but the swing and potential outcomes with Caleb Williams makes him a weekly boom or bust play. Now Arizona, they just played pretty well against Tua and the Dolphins last week, but Arizona on the season still does allow the 7th most fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, so Caleb Williams right here at number 15. At 16, this is where we got Tua going up against Buffalo, and Tua against Buffalo isn't exactly a matchup he has excelled at in his career. Multiple times he's suffered major concussions against the Buffalo Bills. Does that play a factor mentally? Now, no one outside of Tua can really answer that question truthfully, but it is something to think about. Tua only has 7 career passing touchdowns against the Buffalo Bills in 8 career games. Buffalo is a lot easier to run on than throw on, and they allow the 6th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, so Tua's at 16. Then we got Geno Smith going up against the Rams. He's coming off his worst game of the season, and not having DK Metcalf on the field, it actually makes a difference. Week 8 was actually the first game of the season where Geno Smith didn't have a touchdown. Now, it was a tough matchup going up against Buffalo, but now the matchup going up against the Rams, they're a lot more vulnerable through the air, and if DK Metcalf can find his way on the field this week, Geno may actually climb a couple spots in the rankings. Now, after Geno, we got Jameis Winston of the Cleveland Browns going up against the Chargers. And how can you see all these social media clips of Jameis Winston and not be rooting for the guy at this point? He comes in and he beats Baltimore in his first start last week. Had 334 yards passing, 3 touchdowns, no interceptions, and really spread the ball around. We know this run game is still not 100% in Cleveland, but this is a tougher matchup this week than it was last week against Baltimore. The Chargers allow the 8th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. And with all the great options we have in week 9, it makes Jameis Winston number 18. Then we got CJ Stroud of the Houston Texans going up against the Jets. So first he loses Nico Collins. Now he's lost Stephon Diggs, and now he gets a tough matchup going up against the Jets, who allow the 5th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. In the one game last year where Tank played and Nico didn't, Stroud was the QB 9 overall. So can he have a ceiling game with just Tank Dell? For sure. But that matchup last year was against Cincinnati and not a tough road matchup like this one against the Jets. Which will then take us to number 20, his opponent in that matchup, Aaron Rodgers, going up against Houston, and he has more fantasy points on the season than CJ Stroud and Patrick Mahomes, but nobody really thinks about it. And it has to be because the Jets just aren't playing great at all, but Rodgers has been a solid mid-quarterback too most of the season. He's had multiple touchdowns in 3 of his last 4 games, and we already know that it's easier to throw on Houston than it is to run on them. We haven't really seen that connection between Aaron Rodgers and Davante Adams pay off, but this is a good opportunity for it. So there you have our top 20 quarterbacks for week 9 fantasy football. Now, like I always say in our rankings videos, your rankings may be slightly different than mine, and that's okay. No one is sleeping on a player or no one is disrespecting a player. Those comments make no sense. If you do see something a little bit differently though, leave a comment down below in the comment section. When we come together as a community, that's how we build the best damn rankings in the land. Now I'm going to go ahead and get after the day though. Hopefully you enjoy the rest of your day, and then most importantly, do your part to make the world a better place.
Analytics off the chain, off the channel.